Could Lelouch from Code GEASS catch Light Yagami from Death Note? Lelouch Vi Britannia, a Britannian high school student who's a member of the Britannian royal family. From a young age, his wish has not only been to defeat Britannia, but make the world a kinder and gentler place for his sister Nanali. Lelouch's dream finally becomes realized upon making a contract with C2 and gaining the power of GEASS. With his GEASS, all he has to do is make eye contact and can control anyone he desires. He then forms a rebel group to oppose the Holy Britannian Empire, the Black Knights, and the ongoing back and forth battle between Lelouch and Britannia begins. But what if we change things? Let's put Lelouch in the Death Note universe and have him replace L as the lead detective in the Kira case, one of the hardest cases known to man, involving gods of death and a supernatural notebook that can kill anyone as long as their names is written down and face is seen. A battle of wits to test Lelouch's intelligence. Now before we can start this matchup, we need to go over a few things, the terms and conditions. Lelouch will not have access to his GEASS, Black Knights, or Nightmare Frames. Due to C2 though, he is aware of the GEASS's existence and the mechanics of it. This term may seem useless to point out, but its importance will be brought to light later on. No pun intended, by the way. Light, however, is free to use the Death Note as he's already done in canon. This is simply a cat and mouse situation, with Lelouch replacing L as the detective or being the cat and Kira being the mouse. C2 will act as Lelouch's Watari, and she can assist him with the case in whatever way she sees fit. She'll still have her immortality, so if Light were to figure out her name somehow and write it in the Death Note, it wouldn't work. Since Lelouch will be replacing L, he'll obviously have L's influence still. L's influence is important as it allows him to work outside the law and use his own methods to solve cases. And now for the winning conditions for this video. Lelouch has to convict Light with substantial evidence of being Kira. Failure to do so will result in this counting as a loss for Lelouch. If Lelouch can't convict Light and has to resort to killing him, it will also count as a loss. And finally, if Light kills himself before Lelouch can catch or convict him, it also counts as a loss for Lelouch. This may seem odd, but in L Changed the World, when the 13-day rule was found out to be fake, L was on the verge of beating Light. Light decided to kill himself as he knew L would consider this a loss, as despite having the evidence needed to convict Light, he wasn't able to present it to anyone as the main suspect wound up dead. Light's only win condition is to kill Lelouch, and he is free to do so in a number of ways, but the most notable one would be to find out his real name and have his name written in the notebook. So the terms and conditions are now set. Make sure to subscribe and get me to 30k subscribers. I do a lot of content like this, and soon we're going to be doing a lot more like Usukoi, Light Game, various others, so make sure to subscribe. Let's get into the scenario to see if Lelouch could solve the Kira case. The plot starts off as usual, with the Death Note falling in front of Light's very eyes. He picks it up, takes it back home, and from there things begin to play out as they did in canon. Light starts to kill off criminals. Before I continue into the scenario, it's important to touch upon Light's philosophy as a whole, with it being, is murder wrong if it's for the betterment of the world? Basically, intent is where the answer lies, and in Light's scenario, the answer lies within searching to obtain world peace. With the world peace and crimes abolished, not only would the human race flourish, but seeing as though Light takes his so-called justice to a level comparable to that of littering, this ultimately can help the environmental problems that are mostly solved pollution-wise. And there are many more problems around the world that can be solved indirectly when people don't have to worry about corruption by power-hungry people stabbing them in the back. Since Light's aim is to abolish evil in the world, is there any more noble or honorable cause for murder? Light had a promising future ahead of him. He was the top-ranked student in Japan, with an intellect not seen in decades, and grades putting that of honest students to shame. With all those gifts and benefits, his life could have been very well off, but in Light's eyes, he sacrificed that for the future, for the betterment of the world. He would morally bear the weight of all the sins in the world and erase all traces of evil, so that in the end, as Ryuk stated, if you killed every criminal in the world, you'd be the last guy standing. Light truly believed himself to be a god, and by definition, he very well classified as one having power to control the environment and all of humanity. With the Death Note taking upon the role of Kira, he could control all crime in the world with a power only he could accurately wield. Light acknowledges himself as a god because he knows that it is what he will be. All the pieces are in place for this to happen, and with this power, he will bring about change to the world. He believes that the world had to be fixed, and only he alone could accomplish it. But why? What's the point of Light's god complex? From a writing standpoint, it obviously makes sense, but what's significance of Light's philosophy in the scenario? Well, Obata wrote Light this way because for the sole purpose of having something the detectives working on the case could grasp onto, or in this scenario, Lelouch Vi Britannia. From here on, more and more killings would take place, and eventually, this is the part in canon where the police would ask L to take on the case. But in our scenario, he is replaced by Lelouch. To find out how Lelouch would go on about convicting Light differently than L, we need to see how he works in comparison to him. L is credited as the world's greatest detective in Death Note. In the LABB murder case novel, Mello states his intelligence is comparable to that of 5 ordinary investigative bureaus and 7 intelligence agencies all put together. His skills of interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence, the former being the ability to understand others and interact with others. Though in L's cases, he uses interactions with others to gain information and also gain even more understanding. And with the latter being understanding oneself and one's own thoughts and feelings, are what allowed L to be so efficient in detective work. However, just interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence is an understatement when discussing L. L's deductions, abstract thinking, and logical reasoning, while often having at least some justification behind them, are literally all beyond reasonable comprehension. He creates an almost complete psychological profile on Light based on one television broadcast and manages to deduce that there is a second Kira because the behavior and abilities of this one are slightly different. For any normal human, there'd be too much to consider to be 100% certain of any of these problems. But it's not just L's way of thinking, which makes it so unparalleled. It's all the knowledge he possesses thanks to his academic background. He comes from an institution known as Wami's House, an orphanage that takes in gifted children and trains them to be capable successors of L. Of course, this wasn't always the case, as the goalpost for Wami's changed once Watari picked up L. At just 8 years old, he was so gifted he was able to spot a case involving terrorist bombings, which would eventually lead to World War III. Mello also states in the novels that L's intelligence only grows as he gets older, and by the time he works on the Kira case, he's already 24. Funny enough, however, the closest possible answer to how L thinks is actually told in the second Relight movie. The information as well as just how canon the Relight movies can be debated. But regardless, L states, I try to envision the events that take place as individual elements. I can then make a note of each one, but I gain a better understanding when I combine all of these again as a whole, which is why I have very bad handwriting. With all of this to consider, how does Lelouch compare? Can a battle strategist truly be a competent detective? Can he compare to someone like L, who's been nicknamed God's intuition, even though solving cases and detective work isn't Lelouch's main forte? Whenever he's put up to complete something in that area, he always excels. In Season 1, Episode 14, upon meeting Mal, Mal states, "Didn't C2 tell you about me?" And from this single sentence alone, Lelouch uses abductive reasoning to come up with over 14 different possibilities of Mal's true identity. One of these ended up being right. To explain just how crazy this feat is, the words alone Lelouch would have to used to describe every possibility for Mal's backstory would have been in the thousands for all 14 possibilities. And he was able to process all of that information in just a split second. Prior to meeting Mal, in that very same episode, he was able again to use abductive reasoning to trace his own crime scene and come to the conclusion that 2 people were able to unmask and see his face, all because of the different blood splatters around him. Lelouch's feats only get crazier as the series progresses, and if you think coming up with 14 different scenarios to a suspect's true identity was impressive, then how about accurately predicting the same person's thought process so down to earth it was as if Lelouch knew Mal for longer than he really did. Lelouch only met Mal once, and based on his relationship with C2, he was able to determine how a conversation between him and Mal would go, and proceeds to pre-record an entire conversation for Mal, which even had the correct amount of pauses to make it seem more genuine. In terms of knowledge, Lelouch already has an extensive knowledge on battle strategy. So great that it not only surpasses that of Todo, a soldier with decades more experience in battle than Lelouch, but it can rival and also surpass that of Schneisel, who has narrative and statements that implies he's outright smarter than Lelouch. People tend to overlook Lelouch's intelligence and chalk it down to battle IQ, but it's far more than that. What makes Lelouch such a threat is how his brain works. No matter the situation or problem, he always seems to have a solution. Whether it be in the heat of battle or given limited time, Lelouch will always find a way to prevail. If you want something even crazier with his feats, Lelouch states in Code Geass Lost Colors that if something happens, I prepared 1024 ways of dealing with it. I can perfectly respond to any situation at any given time. While the game in question is non-canon, there is an argument for it to be a feat holding up with Lelouch in canon. This is because of the flare feat performed during the Battle of the Planet against Sneasel. Lelouch had to match the flare, a warhead beyond a supercomputer, all in the span of 19 seconds. Nina, the creator of the flare, states the bomb changes composition from moment to moment, and to stop the flare, you would have to hit it with a reaction corresponding to that. Not only do you have to enter the environmental data within 19 seconds, but even if you complete the sequence, you still have 0.04 seconds for it to execute. What this means is that if Lelouch even wasted just a second of time inputting the code, the flare would have detonated and he would have still been killed. Despite all of these disadvantages, Lelouch was still able to stop the flare and still had leftover time to command Suzaku during this entire ordeal. The most important thing to take away from this feat is, if you don't understand it, it's basically that Lelouch quite possibly just has superhuman levels of thinking, as he's always able to come up with possibilities for any given situation in a short amount of time span. This all may seem crazy, but L's thought process and especially intuition makes Lelouch's feats look more reasonable due to how absurd L's are. Now that we've gone over how Lelouch and L think, we can continue with this scenario. First off, would it even be possible for Lelouch to profile Kira? The Kira case was easily L's most difficult case to solve, and even the case that cost him his life. It was him who laid the groundwork and gathered the evidence in which his successors put the final piece together to defeat Light. Some may argue that it was only easy for L to profile Kira because he and L were similar. What that means is, intrapersonally, L understands himself so much that he can figure out Kira because of this. Therefore, it'd be much harder for Lelouch to do the same with Light. But people underestimate Lelouch. They think just because his series is mainly focused on battle strategy than detective work, he'd be at a total disadvantage. Well, Lelouch has shown feats of detective work in his own series, and it wasn't even the main focus of the show. And yet, whenever he performed these feats, they were always impressive. Lelouch would immediately set his sights on Japan after getting information regarding where the first rational death by heart attack occurred, especially because the first death was only broadcasted on Japanese media. From here, things could go one of two ways. Lelouch could either use the investigators in Japan to find the pattern of the killings, or if you think Lelouch's pattern recognition is good enough, he'd be able to figure out this on his own. Regardless, it would leave Lelouch focusing on the time of day that the killings occurred. From there, Lelouch will not only come to the conclusion that Kira is a student, but he also may possibly latch onto the pattern that L initially missed, was the type of criminals actually being killed. All criminals being killed had their names and faces publicly broadcasted. However, criminals who weren't publicly broadcasted on the news or any media were actually left alive. This could then lead for Lelouch to deduce that Kira must need a person's name and face to kill them, and consider the possibility of Kira's killings via some sort of power. Keep in mind that Lelouch is even aware of such high powers existing in his own universe via GEASS. It wouldn't be too far-fetched for him to assume that Kira could be killing with a power of his own, as no single person could kill that many people with their own bare hands per day and remain uncaught. However, we need to remember that Light won't just be sitting idly. He'll have access to police information and come to find out that L, Lelouch, is on his trail. But would Light attempt to search for Lelouch's real name? I don't believe so, as the only reason Light went through all the trouble of searching for L's real name is because he publicly challenged him and provoked him. The battle of pride between Light and L was a personal one, where L rubbed the idea of his real name all over Light's face. I don't think Lelouch would try and publicly go for Kira. Not unless he had a strategy in mind, and if he intended to do so, it would be by the endgame, which means he's gathered enough evidence to convict Light, and all he needs to do is draw him out to finish the battle. Assuming Light has access to police information and finds out that someone going by the name of L is searching for him, he would assume it was just another regular detective or agent, only he's from a foreign country. Light didn't think much of Lindell Taylor and killed him as an example since he was publicly threatened. In canon, L used Lindell Taylor as a ploy to prove to the public that Kira was real and all the deaths weren't a coincidence, which is part of L's character. He's willing to sacrifice people to win the game. As I stated, not just in the guidebooks, but in the series itself, that, like Kira, L also hates to lose. But would Lelouch use a pawn to catch Light? Yes, he would, but if there was a better strategy that he didn't have to involve sacrifice, he would more than be willing to take it. Lelouch understands the casualties of war are inevitable, but he isn't bloodthirsty. Despite what people may think, he still cares for others and won't focus on getting others killed unless he has no choice. Lelouch would more than likely try and get direct contact with Light, focusing on the fact that Kira may be a student. Light would immediately change his pattern of killing, which Lelouch would catch on to. In canon, the very next day Light finds out that L believes Kira is a student, he changes up his method of killing. As L did, Lelouch would deduce there is a leak in the police force and come to the conclusion that someone has access to classified information. All of these factors would lead to Lelouch still focusing on the fact that Kira could be a student. However, he would also be inclined to believe that Kira is an intellectual student, No person of average intelligence could kill people so methodically and routinely, even if they had the advantage of knowing the enemy's information. Lelouch's list of suspects would get smaller and smaller until it would eventually be either one of the many high-ranking students in the Kanto region of Japan or the best one himself. Lelouch would then cycle through the top-ranking students' names and backgrounds until one sticks out to him the most. Light Yagami, a perfect honor student with a humble family, but his father is the chief of the MPA. From here, all would start to make sense. Kira being an intellectual student, having access to classified police information, and interestingly enough being the son of the chief. From here, Lelouch would be eager to talk to Light to be able to profile and understand him more. I could see him catching Light as he is about to enter school. Now the biggest question is, could Lelouch really profile Light? Light is a master of interpersonal relationships, and it's possible that Light would be able to outsmart Lelouch in this situation, using words to lower suspicion. However, I don't see Lelouch biting that easily. When Lelouch's mind is set on something, he decides to act. All the pieces are in place, and his intuition, though not as good as L's, would be screaming towards Light. Even if you think Lelouch wouldn't be able to understand Light on a deeper level, then that's where you're wrong. Remember, Lelouch only met Mao once and was able to engineer and pre-record a conversation based on Mao as an individual, realizing just how obsessed he was with C2. Where Light shines in interpersonal intelligence, Lelouch's social intelligence and charisma is completely off the charts. Lelouch's final plan, the Zero Requiem, is some of the most interesting feats in emotional intelligence I've seen. He was able to understand and perceive that all human beings need a villain to hate, so they could fight towards peace. He made himself the villain, doing things that would make the entire collective world hate him. He used speeches, manipulation, and deception to appeal to fear and negative emotions, basically painting himself as a tyrant. He then understood how relieved the world would be if he were to die. He knew that the people of the world would use those emotions of relief and hope to fight for a better future and never end up serving evil again. He understood and perceived the fact that people want freedom. They fight when they are oppressed. Human beings are capable of moving on, and they will strive for the future. He also knew how they would react to his action, and how him being a tyrant would affect their emotions. He was able to come to this realization regarding all of humanity, even though he himself hasn't talked or interacted with a percentage of all humans on Earth. Lelouch would understand Kira's reasoning for the killings. He wanted to change the world and persecute criminals. Having a father so deeply involved in justice would mold such an ideology into their own flesh and blood, that being Light Yagami. However, in turn, Light would also counter-analyze Lelouch in the first encounter and realize he is somebody he should be wary of, which may lead him to do more research on the classified police documents. However, it wouldn't matter. Lelouch would have got what he came for, and have enough information on Light to know that he is Kira. But Lelouch figuring out Kira is one thing, but finding the necessary evidence in itself is an entirely different thing. Lelouch contacts C2 to meet him at the Yagami household, and there they would search through Light's room. They would have to set off the safety measures that Light placed at the door, but it wouldn't matter. Lelouch would be confident that he'd find what he was looking for, and by the time Light returns home, he'd be finished. It would take some time, as Lelouch and C2 would have several hours to search Light's room, but eventually C2 would tell Lelouch about Light's hidden drawer. Lelouch would inspect it for a while and realize there's a false bottom. Now keep in mind that Light has one final trap installed, as depending on how the false bottom of the drawer is opened, it will lead to the definite setting on fire and destroying the physical evidence. But Lelouch is experienced in diffusing situations like this. Take as in episode 16 when Nanali was kidnapped, he was able to analyze which type of bomb was hanging from the ceiling. It was motion sensitive and had a solenoid inside of it that kept it moving, and any external force would cause it to go off. He figured out all of this by looking at it and could figure out how to defuse it in 1 minute. Light's trap pales in comparison to how complex and advanced the bomb trap that Mal set was. He'd figure out how to defuse the insulator and preventing the detonate from setting on fire before he grasps the notebook. He would then open it and read the contents, seeing all victims' names written down as well as how they'd die. Lelouch previously pondered the possibility of Kira having some sort of power, and right he was. And there he would realize this is it. At this point, Light would be finished, as Lelouch would have all the reasoning and physical evidence to convict Light. Even if Light tried to emotionally manipulate his family and the people around him, Lelouch would have counter upon counter to any arguments he tries to use. Lelouch already had an argument with Schnazel regarding the fate of the world, whether the past, present, or future of all of humanity was more important. The reason why Light would lose to Lelouch mainly comes from a lack of experience in underestimating his opponent, which we've seen numerous times against L, Nier, and even Mello. But what if Lelouch got involved in the Kira case after L died? Would the scenario be any different? This would be much harder for Lelouch, as he's now dealing with a more experienced Light who has Misa and Mikami, with both Shinigami eyes. Even though Lelouch would have much more information to work with via the MPA talking about Light's imprisonment, Shinigami, and etc., I don't believe Lelouch could solve the Kira case. He'd be able to figure out that Light is Kira, but in Death Note, proof trumps all, and Light has experience in destroying damning evidence such as the memory loss plan, and who knows how much Light had planned after L's death. Like Lelouch, Light only improves and arguably gets more intelligent via the many strategies and plans he uses in his battle against L's successors. If not for Mello sacrificing himself, he would have very well won. So to conclude, Lelouch can solve the Kira case, but it matters how early he gets involved. If it's at the start of the series, although it would take much more time, he could eventually get the proof he needs to convict Light. But if he gets involved during the second part of Death Note, Light would win.